So I believe this is where we left off last Tuesday. And get us through this, and we were talking mostly last Tuesday about brain development and sense and some of our senses such as sight and hearing, and I think we ended with a topic of pain, how infants do feel pain even pre-birth. Um, and we mentioned that currently the line of research is maybe that's why we experience infantile amnesia, that most of us really cannot remember, the birthing process and all of that because of the amount of pain that the infant probably, well, did go through. And that's kind of one of the current lines of research into why we experience that thing we call infantile amnesia. Um, But let's talk, and we did talk about the adaptive features of infants. That one of the current theories of why they have such cute cheeks and large eyes and whatnot is um, um, because it provides a protective factor that you even because they need care 24/7. That kind of cuteness factor makes it adaptive for them so that we continue to care for them. Baby's weight, again, I think this is kind of a review, doubles by fifth month and triples by 1 year. So pretty rapid growth during that first year. Uh, so something to kind of think about and kind of review. So let's talk about motor development. Because again, the idea is that we go from what are known as reflexes to then voluntary motor control over those adaptive reflexes. So, what is an infant reflex? Well, it's a pattern involuntary motor response. Okay. So, for example, if you rub their little cheek, they will start the suckling motion. Um, if they have a startle reflex. If you do something to startle them, let's just bang a cymbal together behind their back, they'll go through a startle response. Um, but what we do find is that as the brain develops, we start to take control of these reflexes and they become more of a behavior pattern than a involuntary reflex. Okay. And one thing that you'll note when an infant is born, they take him over to the little exam area and they poke his little toes and they stroke his little cheek and all of those kinds of things because what we have found is that if a reflex is missing, that may denote some type of neurological problem in the infant. So they go over and they do, I think it's a 6 sequence test on the infant to make sure that all the reflexes that are available at birth and whatnot are present. If not, they then go into an examination mode, usually dealing with things like brain scans and those things. Because the earlier we catch a neurological problem, the more likely that the plasticity of the brain through training will adapt to whatever loss is present. So we want to catch it as early as possible so that the deficits can be made up through training of some type of the brain in the infant. Okay. So what are some reflexes that tend to occur and when do they approximately disappear? Well, we find that the sucking reflex, which is usually present at birth and lasts for about 2 months. And again, when you touch the baby's roof of the mouth or even just the cheek on the side, they start to do the sucking reflex. And of course, that's adaptive, right? It's what their first nutrients are going to come from. The crawling reflex usually disappears around the 2 months. This isn't a infant can't crawl. Okay, a newborn can't crawl. But what happens is if you place an infant on the tummy they will start to push their legs as if they're trying to make themselves crawl, and it's an involuntary movement. Okay. The more reflex, or what's also known as a startle reflex, is this is when a baby loses support and feels like she might be falling or hearing loud sounds. Most babies will cry and pull their limbs back in, almost kind of like they're going into a fetal position. And this has usually gone about 3 months. Stepping reflex. This is when the baby is supported, but his feet, but let his feet touch the ground. They will lift their feet up as if they're in a walking motion. Okay. The stepping reflex also is kind of the same thing. It looks like that there can be stepping when they let the feet touch the ground. And then what's called tonic net. This is when a baby is placed on his back and his head is turned to the side. He will stretch his arms and legs in the direction his face is speaking. Oh, that one's kind of a fun one. And that goes away around about the fourth month of development. Bambinski reflex is when you stroke the side of the foot of the baby. The big toe points up and other toes will fan out. That one's cute too. Rooting reflex is when you gently stroke the cheek again. He will turn the direction that they're feeling the touch. And the palmar grasp is when you touch the baby's palm and your index finger. They will clench the hand. That's when they grab your hand. Gag reflex is when the throat is contracted. Just like adults, this is one reflex that doesn't disappear. They will go into a choking gag reflex. And another one that doesn't disappear is eye blinking when touched or exposed suddenly to bright lights. Okay. Those are the only kind of reflexes that we continue to have from birth on. Okay. And again, when an infant is burned, when an infant is born, they go through and make sure all of these reflexes are present. That's why, you'll see a doctor with a little flashlight kind of going in and out to see if the infant is blinking. And they'll touch the side of the finger to see if the infant will grasp it, and all of these things. Because again, if these are not present, then that's a concern for the doctors and the medical professionals that there might be something neurological going on. Okay. So, we'll be talking a lot about this in the from infancy clear through early childhood up to about the age of 8, and that's the difference between gross motor skills and fine motor skills. Gross motor skills are the movement of a large body. So you could think of, for example, just moving your arms up and down, or a gross movement of walking. Fine motor skills are the smaller movements. It's being able to pick things up. It's being able to write. It's being able to use your lips and tongues to talk. So it's using the finer motors, the fingers and the lip and the face muscles to create some type of behavior. Okay. And we usually develop from gross motor skills to fine motor skills. Okay. And this really has to do with the myelination of motor neurons, which happens in two directions. One, from the head down, and then from the torso outward. Okay, so our motor skills really start with, for example, being able to hold up your neck, right? And then being able to hold yourself upright in a sitting position. So that is from the head down, and then eventually you're able to stand, which is then your legs out. And then the last things to kind of start to develop is our arm strength and our arm movement and our hands. So that's outward, and our feet. Hence, we usually are able to crawl before we walk, um, because that's the middle outward part of thing, and that's a proximal modal type development. So we kind of develop from head down and from the center of the body out. Okay. So as this suggests, this is an example of proximal modal. So we start with our torso, and then if we're looking at our upper body, we then develop our arms, and then our hands, and then our ability to do our fine motor skills with our fingers. Okay. And that's kind of that development from the center out. And then, so these are kind of difficult to really determine. And the thing that I would really encourage everyone to really pay attention is not necessarily the mean or the average, but the range. Okay. If we're concerned about development or development of any motor skills, it's whether these motor skills develop beyond this range. So, if, for example, an infant isn't able to hold their head up erect and steady after 4 months, then we start to get concerned about potential upper spinal damage, okay, or something to deal with the neck, okay. But if your infant isn't there by the mean, the average of 1.6 months, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be delayed. It just means that the range for them to accomplish that task, that motor task, is going to be longer. And as this suggests, there's infants who do it before the 1.6 months. And I'm going to say this. This doesn't make this is not doesn't necessarily mean that they will be advanced in their motor skills. Okay. So just before if they do it before that or after that, the thing to pay attention to if you're worried about any types of disability or something is looking beyond the range, not the mean. Okay. So holds up, head up erect around 1.6 months on average, between zero point 0.7 to 4 months. Sits with support by about 2, 3 months. And then as you go through this, you can kind of see that proximal and dorsal thing. So we start with our head, and then we start with our torso with the sitting with support, and then lift head, shoulders, and forearms, which is more outward, and then can sit momentarily with support. And by about the 11.7 month on average, or before about 16 months of age, walking independently. Okay. And so we can see how this has worked again from the head down and from the center out. Okay. And again, this just emphasizes a point that there's variability in milestones. It's highly canalized, but may go slower for some infants. Okay. And one thing to note is cognitive development can outpace motor development. And this is important in two areas. Our ability to use language is largely a motor ability. Um, so if an infant isn't talking by the average, which we'll get to when we get to cognitive development, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a learning disability or a cognitive disability, because their cognitive development can be way outpassing their motor ability to develop language. Um, but in some cases, unfortunately, there are a lot of children who are diagnosed with a developmental delay, even though their cognitive capacity is just fine. Their intellectual capacity is just fine. It's just the motor areas that produce language are not as advanced as or as progressive as their cognitive ability. And it's kind of a what I call an adult fault in understanding cognition. and intellect. Okay. Um, and we should also note that there are lots of studies, there's a few here that are quite old, that talk about variation based on experience. Okay. So, for example, parents who believe in binding their children or doing that heavy wrap blanket tend to have slower delay in being able to walk and hold themselves upright than children who are not bound as infants. If we look at some of the um, um, research in some Asian cultures, because for women, small feet are preferenced, they tend to do what's called binding of infants' feet. Okay. And what we have found is, and so they bind the feet really, really tight. And what we find is it takes a lot longer for these infant girls to develop walking and walking abilities because their feet have been bound. Um, and so those are all, so it's important to state is that both cognitive and motor abilities are not just determined by biology and um, genetics. Okay, is it also is based upon the experience and the infant's ability to experience the world in a motor method. So being able to use their muscles, to use them to see what they do, also plays a role in the developmental phase of motor development. So it's a combination of their environment and biology. And this is another example of motor development and motor skill. Okay. Is that this is an example of how infants naturally will use emotional cues of other people to determine whether a motor action is appropriate or not. Okay. So in this experiment, they basically have a table, and infants by about 8 or 12 weeks are able to see depth. Okay. So this little guy is going to come across here and he's going to come to this ledge and he's going to notice, hey, if I go much further, I'm going to fall. Okay. Um, Now, just to let you know, they put a very heavy glass plate right here. So if the little dude decides to continue on, he won't fall. So just to put that out there. Oh, we're not totally cruel, but so you have the infant come and they come to this ledge, which is an ambiguous situation because they can see a drop, but then they have the parent usually at the other end, and the parent is either saying stop, 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 or they're doing what in the picture, they're saying, come on, it'll be okay. Okay. And because this situation is ambiguous to the infant, if the parent is saying, no, 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 don't come, they don't understand the no, no, no or anything, but they can read the emotional cues and the parent's hands up and that emotional cue, so they won't go across on the glass plate. Okay. However, if the parent says it's okay, the infant will then kind of feel and they'll notice, oh, there is a hard surface here. Um, Dad's saying in this picture, I think that's dad. Dad is saying it's okay. So the infant will go ahead and crawl on top of the glass plate. Okay. And so we know that in motor development, infants use quite a bit of their environmental information to determine whether a motor behavior is appropriate or not. And interestingly, they already understand, and this is why I've said in here before, our first language is emotions. We don't need a language of spoken words to understand the emotional cues of other people. The difficulty is then when we develop language, if the environment and the emotion are not congruent, we can mislabel those emotions. And that becomes the difficult part. So, so that's something to consider is infants come to the world with a knowledge of the meaning of emotions. They're actually better at telling what an emotion is than adults are. But then through language development and experience, they can then start to mislabel those emotions. And we'll talk a lot about that when we get to language development and how miswiring of emotions and language can really play havoc on the individual's life. Okay. Okay. The other thing that we should note is that for newborns, and I think for people my age, sleep is very important. When we look at the total hours of sleep for an infant, here we have about 24 hours. This is the total amount of sleep an infant should have. And this is the nighttime sleep. And if you can see, as time goes on, it goes down um, quite a bit. And so for newborns, I kind of like to think of them as cats. If they're sleeping about 16 hours a day, they're doing good. If they sleep less than that, they tend to have this is one of the causes, it's not all of the causes, they can become colicky, which means that they are in a constant state of crying. And if you want to think of this level of stress, with no really explainable reason. It's not because they're hungry. It's not because they're not being comforted. It's not. Colicky is kind of crying without a cause or a cause that can be found. And sleep deprivation in infancy is one of the potential causes of colickiness. Okay. Um, but also, we also find that infants who are deprived of the sleep, meaning parents who put their infants on schedules and they keep them purposely awake at certain times without allowing them to have a natural cycle of sleep, tend to end up with things like cognitive delays, behavioral problems, and the like. So, we found that to be another issue when we look at things like sleep deprivation for infants and not allowing them to have a natural cycle of sleep. Also, interestingly, if infants are allowed to have a natural sleep cycle, meaning you allow the infant to determine when they sleep, they actually end up sleeping through the night at a much faster rate than when they're put on a schedule by the parent. So, something to consider if you're one of those who enjoy your night's sleep and you have an infant, let them run the show and you'll be able to get a good night's sleep much quicker than if you try to run the show. Something to kind of consider from the research that has been done. Okay. So about 16 to 18 hours of sleep, 6 month old, about 12 hours. And then as you can see, it reduces. Okay. And again, the other thing that we should mention out is the big controversy between the cry it out method of sleep. This is still heavily recommended by some pediatricians and whatnot to cry it out and whatnot. And it became very big in, I believe, the 1970s, where in order to get an infant to sleep, you just put them in the bed on your schedule and just leave and let them cry it until they fall asleep. We still are finding large evidence that that's not a good thing to do. One, they'll wake up more often during the night period. Two, we find some emotional and psychological issues, and also some cognitive delay from the cry it out method of trying to control infants, kind of going back to that idea that infants are born with a natural cycle of sleep and wake. And when we try to disrupt that, it can cause havoc within the biological motor systems of the infant. And then we should talk about stress and coping when we're talking about this. So, is it good for an infant to experience stress? The answer is yes, in small amounts. The hormone that primarily is played during stress is what's known as cortisol. It's a hormone that prepares your baby to threaten challenge threats or challenges. It's that fight or flight response when you sense of some type of danger or challenge, and your biological system goes through a sympathetic response, which prepares the body for fight or flight. During that um, system, your body will naturally start to shut down unnecessary organs for fight or flight. So it'll start to shut down, for example, the digestive system because it doesn't want to be expending energy on digesting food. It'll shut down other unnecessary systems at that time. Okay. And what we find is that a little bit of stress helps development, allowing a child to experience certain amounts of stress are important. But when the stress becomes overwhelming, when the stress becomes constant and unpredictable, this is where an infant can end up having constant releases of cortisol, and if not reversed, they can end up in a continued sympathetic state. Okay. Meaning that they're unable to, that they tend to end up having things like digestive problems. They become very hypervigilant. Some evidence suggests that a lot of hyperactivity in some infants are because they came out of very stressed infant environments. And so in early childhood, they're unable to calm themselves down to a what's called a parasympathetic state, which is relaxed and okay. And then we also see some cognitive deficits. So, but the good news is, again, if we catch these little guys early with a sensitive caregiving, we can reverse the effects of infant stress. So, even the most traumatized infant, if through the rest of their early childhood are cared for by a sensitive caregiving person, those effects of early infant trauma can be reversed. So, something to consider that this isn't something that is permanent, but can be reversed if it's done before about the age of 8 is about the time, kind of the cutoff that long-lasting trauma and stress is not going to have a long-term impact. So some things to consider. Okay. All right. All right, so I think this is a good place to stop because I don't want to break cognitive development up. So I'm going to stop